This is my first time here at PASA. I'm very excited to be here. And I have to tell you that you guys have just taken great care of me. I want to particularly thank Brian Snyder, who was so conscientious that he arranged a phone call with me before I came. And he wanted to make sure, he was very careful to make sure I understood that PASA has a very, very diverse membership. And one of the things that he explained to me is that the political views vary widely. And he said, Shannon, we have everything from the Green Party to the Tea Party here. And Brian, wherever you are, I want to let you know, I promise to offend everyone equally. It's very convenient that you guys didn't get too much of an intro, because I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking to you about who I am and where I'm coming from. My husband, Bob, very sweetly tells me that I have a tendency to be a bit strident when I stand up here at the podium. And so I'm hoping that maybe if you understand more about my background, you'll be able to forgive a little bit of my brashness. I work with my family on Sapbush Hollow Farm, where I grew up, and it's located in the very steep hills of upstate New York. It's funny, they told me when I was coming out here that this was the mountainous area. But these hills have been known to see frost 11 months out of the year, so one of the ways that we make a viable living on that land is through the production of grass-fed meat. And as a result, meat has become something of a centerpiece in my life. We do a lot of our own processing on the farm, and one of my jobs is overseeing cut fabrication and meat inventory. And Bob and I are also responsible for taking our products every week to our farmers market. And that's where we get to watch Americans stroll by and develop evolving ideas about what this local food movement has to do with their future sustainability. So that makes me a bit of a social critic. But before the end of today, you'll also notice it does make me a true optimist. In addition, I write and I research about sustainability in our culture, and I also write cookbooks about meat, of course. Also, Bob and I homeschool our two daughters. Saoirse is 8, and Ula is going to turn 5 in about a month. So as you can probably imagine, having a background where your parents raise meat, slaughter animals, cut up meat, sell meat, and cook meat, these kids are getting a very interesting homeschool education, and we hadn't really thought about that until something transpired last winter. I was working on my newest cookbook. It's called Long Way on a Little, An Earth Lover's Companion for Enjoying Meat, Pinching Pennies, and Living Deliciously. And the premise of the book is that responsible meat production does play a role in a sustainable food system, and responsible meat consumption need not be a violation of ecological principles, nor does it have to be prohibitively expensive. However, in order to do this, Americans must change the way that they're eating. For one thing, we need to get better at working with leftovers. Refrigerator waste in this country is appalling. We also need to become proficient at working with the 20 to 30% of every animal that I see come through our cutting room that goes to waste because nobody wants to do anything with the bones, the skin, the fat, or the organ meats. Of course, in order to write this book, I myself had to learn how to work with my leftovers, and I had to become proficient at working with that 20 to 30% that goes to waste. So all last winter, I was writing these crazy recipes for livers and heads, feet, skin, kidneys. I know, you're dying for the book to come out, aren't you? There'll be recipes for steak and pork chops, don't worry. But then came the day when I had to write about cooking with the heart. Now, I'm just curious, how many folks out in the audience are homeschoolers? Yeah, okay, we got a few out here. We got a few. For those of you who don't homeschool, there's something you need to know about us. Homeschoolers come in a rainbow of different flavors. And when one homeschooling family meets another homeschooling family, it's sort of like when dogs sniff butts. I promised you I would offend. Because we come in just such a wide array, and you're always trying to figure out what kind of homeschooler they are. So there's the Waldorfers and Montessoriers and unschoolers and classical education schoolers, faith-based homeschoolers, radical unschoolers, and the list goes on and on. So I happen to know that those homeschooling families that I just saw out here in the audience are wondering, what kind of homeschoolers are Bob and Shannon? I'm just going to tell you, you don't have to sniff my hiney, okay? We are opportunistic and omnivorous homeschoolers. Case in point, there on the kitchen counter last winter was a big old beef heart. So Bob and I decided that we would do a 2-part lesson. In part 1, he sliced the heart open, and he showed the girls the valves, the atrium, the ventricles, and he talked to them about how the heart circulates blood throughout the body. In part 2, I talked to them about eating the heart. And we explained how it's important not to let any part of the animal go to the waste, and how the heart is a source of the fat-soluble vitamins A, D, E, and K. And when our bodies have those, a rich supply of those, we're able to take up the other nutrients that we need in order to thrive. And then I also explained to them that the heart is a muscle that's working all the time, so it builds up a lot of connective tissue. This is to help any of you who came to this talk today hoping for a cooking tip. This is it. When it builds up a lot of connective tissue, the way to break that down and make it tender is by cooking it with liquid. So we decided to make a hearty beef stew. The girls loved it. They each had 2 helpings. They wanted me to serve it again the next day, and they became obsessed with heart meat. Whenever I went down to the farm to cut up an animal, they were waiting at the door when I got home, expecting the heart meat. They ate it stewed, stuffed in peppers, or their personal favorite, skewered on sticks. They wanted me to serve it to their friends. Now, we all know that homeschooled kids have a tendency to march to the beat of their own drum. But even I had to put my foot down on that one. My kids' friends come from families that are not quite as gastronomically adventurous as our own, and I simply could not be responsible for killing their social lives before they were teenagers. I know there's a lot of meat farm families out here who've been through this. Okay. Aside from that, I was thrilled with the new passion. But I have to tell you at the same time that all the heart fury was going on, our family was going through a very sad and a very beautiful time. My grandfather, Saoirse and Ula's great Pop-Pop, was dying. And I say it was a beautiful time because my father and my aunt and my uncle decided that he would be permitted to pass in the peace, comfort, and dignity of his own home. And they took turns staying with him. As a result, Saoirse and Ula became witnesses to his passage. They watched his evolving condition. They were there with me in the final hours when he was calling out to my grandmother who had predeceased him. And they were fully aware when she moved on. Of course, when he moved on, When anyone who has lost a loved one knows that when this happens, there's a moment of quiet, and then all chaos breaks loose. There's all this legal paperwork that has to be done. There's funeral arrangements that have to be made. You have friends and family to contact, all these people flying in from around the country. You have to figure out where they're going to stay and what they're going to eat. And if you're a mom like me, you're madly going through your kids' stuff, trying to find, dresses that haven't been worn in with the chickens, and shoes where the manure's dry enough that you can scrape it off, and stockings that don't have holes in them. And I wasn't paying attention to the fact that Ula, my youngest, was growing increasingly introspective. But there we were. It was the day before the funeral, and I was madly slapping together 3 dozen deviled eggs so we could serve afterwards. And she scrambles up on the kitchen stool next to me. She says, Mommy? Yes, sweetie? What will we do at a funeral? I said, well, the funeral is where we say goodbye to great Pop-Pop. She's quiet for a minute, and then she says, Mommy, are we going to cut up Great Papa and eat his heart? I gazed at my daughter and noticed she bore startling resemblance to Hannibal Lecter. And then I realized, of course she was going to think that. What do we do with anything else that dies on the farm? We cut it up and Mommy brings home the heart. So it made sense. So I hugged her. I explained to her that we don't actually eat people. Made a note in my homeschool folder that we'd kind of sort of did a homeschooling lesson on cannibalism. But for those of you who worry that the memory of my grandfather has been violated in some way, I want to assure you he also was a farmer. He had lived through the Great Depression, and he had a wicked sense of humor. And that man, I know, was grinning from ear to ear in the next realm at the connections his great-granddaughter was making. And I happen to believe it was a personal parting shot. Anyhow, unconventional homeschooling methodologies aside, this background of raising livestock and kids and cutting meat and writing cookbooks has carved out a bit of a niche for me at sustainability and producer gatherings. You see, producers have been coming to events like this for a very long time, as the PASA history will attest. Seeking a pathway around the ecological and spiritual dead end so often proffered by industrial agriculture, farmers and producers have been coming to events like this to learn about on-farm composting and management-intensive grazing and organic crop production. Rather than blindly following industrial agriculture's mandates to apply pesticides for pests and herbicides for weeds, producers have been coming to events like this seeking to employ their minds in service to their ecosystem and to discover the solution that Mother Nature could offer us if only we could learn how to farm in harmony with her. So, of course, if you gazed out at some of these events and you looked out at the audience in the early days, you would begin to see the standard issue uniform. The seed caps, flannel shirts, polo shirts, belt buckles, steel-toed boots, and the like. But then, over time, the audience profile began to change. We began to see Amish and Mennonites in our audience. We began to see some cowboys, and we had some hippies with nose rings, some hipsters. We saw some folks with locks. All of them were coming together under the banner of the word producers, seeking to grow nourishing food directly for their communities. That was cool. We got used to it. But then the audience profile changed again. That's when I started getting phone calls. You can hear right now how the audience profile changed. Did I hear it? It was there a second ago. Okay. Suddenly, there were all these mothers in the audience. Babies strapped to their fronts, tied to their backs, kids running up and down the aisles. And if that wasn't enough, there were all these journalists and foodies and citizen activists and homesteaders and homeschoolers. All of them were coming to these producer gatherings, and nobody was quite sure what the heck they wanted. Well, event organizers started puzzling this through, and they said, well, what's the one thing that everybody has in common? Well, everybody eats. And in Shannon Hayes' family, they don't just grow the hearts, they eat them. So maybe she has something to offer. So I'd get these phone calls asking me to come to these terrific events. I'd say, sure, tell me a little bit about the audience. And someone would usually say, well, it used to be a producer meeting, but now it's producers and consumers. Producers and consumers. I got to tell you, nobody really liked that expression. I mean, to suggest that anyone who doesn't own a farm or a ranch is a consumer seems a little bit pejorative. Some people tried to go PC and say, well, it's producers and citizens, but that sort of implied the producers weren't citizens, and that wasn't popular either. So here we are with an offensive expression, and since I promised to offend, I'm going to use that expression today. Because there's a very important history behind it, and if we can understand the history behind that, I think we're going to see our way into the future a little bit more clearly. You see, producers and consumers didn't become separate sets of people until the Industrial Revolution hit the shores of this country. And once it did, there was a good 150 years or so where everybody coexisted quite peacefully. That's because, with the exception of some refrigerated rail cars that were transporting some food across the country, most things were grown and consumed locally or regionally. All that changed 60 years ago when a second industrial revolution slammed into this country, the agricultural industrial revolution. You see, for those of you who need the short story, there were these chemical companies. They got into business during the World Wars, and they were looking for ways to stay in business. Someone had the sharp idea of dumping the stuff on the food supply and the population in general. There is more to it than that, but basically, America decided that we could industrialize and modernize our farming system, and we could become so efficient that we could feed the world. So we started seeing all this big specialized machinery and these applications of all these petrochemicals, and these food transportation and processing systems were popping up. And ironically, we dubbed this the Green Revolution. And what happened is that we started to see that all these little farms that were supporting the communities began to shut down because the economies of scale didn't work for them, and they simply could not compete. Meanwhile, those farms that could leverage the land and the capital base began to get bigger and bigger, albeit fewer in number, until consumers made up over 98% of the population and producers were less than 2%. I want to change gears for a minute and talk to you about what industrialization does. Industrialization, this is editorializing a bit, but it is the worship of efficiency. And for the sake of efficiency, industrialization takes human beings and it divides them into mind workers and body workers. So if you picture a pyramid, at the top of the pyramid you have the theoretical mind workers. These are the people who are supposed to be calling all the shots, making all the decisions, who theoretically have all the education. At the bottom of the pyramid, you have the body workers, and they are literally just supposed to be a cog in the machine. They're not supposed to really be thinking, employing their problem-solving skills or a sense of craft. They're supposed to be thankful for the significantly smaller wages that they collect, and they're supposed to stay quiet. Now, in order for industrialization to take hold, it is contingent upon a culture's willingness to relinquish a certain degree of self-sufficiency in order to have its needs met. And that can be a good thing, as we'll see in just a minute. But trouble arises when those needs start to get confused with wants, and we begin heading down the slippery slope of consumerism. So let's look at how that played out in the American household. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, the household was the domain of men and women working together for their sustenance. If you think back to America's Revolutionary War, to the characters you may have learned about during that time, the soldiers, the thinkers, the activists, the writers, and the politicians, none of them were just soldiers and thinkers and writers and activists and politicians. They all did something else. They all worked with their minds and with their bodies to contribute to the well-being of the household. I don't know if any of you have ever seen the movie about John Adams' life, but I love this movie because in the opening scene, he's out in the farmyard with his son, holding a pile of steaming fresh cow dung in his hand, waxing poetic about soil fertility. John Adams wasn't just a lawyer. He wasn't just a president of the United States. He was a farmer, as were many of the other men in that area. Just like the women, they all worked together to support the household, which was the sphere of men and women working together. But then the Industrial Revolution hit, and all these factories popped up along the horizon, and the men were the first to go off to work, and leaving the women behind with an awful lot of duties. And this is where we saw the separate spheres come into place. Man was in the workplace and the woman was in the home. We talk about this now like it's a traditional or old concept. It's not. It's a newfangled concept. We've only had it since the Industrial Revolution, and I don't buy into this new idea. So the men were gone, the women were stuck at home, and the labor that they faced was actually becoming a national problem. And here is a case where the Industrial Revolution did step in to offer some valuable assistance. To this day, I remain grateful for our automatic washing machine and our stove. Actually, Bob does all the laundry and my PowerPoints. So he remains thankful for the automatic washing machine, and I remain thankful for the stove and Bob. But to drive this economy forward and really make money, the captains of industry needed Americans to take an interest in more than just a few durable goods. They needed us to become consumers. It started out innocently enough. Don't weave your cloth. You can buy it. Don't sew your clothes. You can just buy the latest fashions. And don't mend them. Throw them out. Buy new. Update and upgrade. And while you're at it, toss out those recipes for those home remedies, because now we have sound science that can help you take care of your family. And please, don't go to the trouble of making your own cleaning solutions, because we have the proven chemicals bestowed upon us by these modern times that can help keep your family safe from germs. And oh my gosh, you're not actually thinking of preserving your garden harvest, are you? You could kill your whole family. It's so dangerous. Allow our food scientists working in the safe and sanitary conditions of our factories to do that for you, so you don't poison your children to death. Well, the American economy grew. But in order for that great American dream to become a reality, we had to forget. We had to forget how to tend a garden, how to sew, how to care for our elderly and our infirm. We forgot how to teach our children what cows and pigs and chickens and sheep eat. We simply had to trust that in this new industrialized consumer culture, there would always be someone somewhere who could do it more efficiently and cheaper than we could possibly do it for ourselves. And all we needed to do was continue to collect a steady paycheck to buy whatever it was that we needed and wanted. This was America's first experiment with consumerism, and it was played out upon the women. Remember, the men had gone away to work. The women were left at home to do the driving and the shopping. It didn't go well. In 1963, Betty Friedan wrote The Feminine Mystique, where she documented what the healthcare industry had been witnessing for quite some time. Housewife syndrome. This is where women were suffering from nervous breakdowns, emotional disorders, and chronic depression, because as it turns out, this life of driving and shopping was not anywhere near as pleasant as the glossy magazines suggested it would be. In response, women entered the workforce. The idea was that by generating a second income, there'd be a greater balance of power in the household, and that she would start to feel better because she'd have a greater sense of self-esteem, because by going out into the workforce, she would finally be making a valuable contribution to society. To a certain degree, that was true. But we need to be willing to think about some of the consequences of that if we're going to pursue a sustainable future. For one thing, we gave America a workforce willing to do the same job at a fraction of the pay. We also drove up the cost of living. The other thing that we don't like to discuss very much when we talk about this change is that we started getting fat. Back in the 1950s, we were one of the healthiest cultures on the planet. Now we're one of the fattest. Essentially, when women left the home, just like men did, there was no one in the home anymore who could oversee the family's nutrition, and we outsourced it to corporations who, surprise of surprises, didn't have family nutrition at heart, but had bottom line in mind instead. So, let me just see here. Back in the 1950s, we were one of the healthiest cultures on the planet, but we managed to undo that quite significantly. In 1967, just after Feminine Mystique came out, per capita consumption of high fructose corn syrup was 0.03 pounds per person per year. By 2006, that number had skyrocketed to 58.2 pounds per person per year. 66% of American adults are now overweight or obese, and 1/3 of our kids are. To oversimplify a bit, in the past, every man, every woman, and every child bore some responsibility for producing for the well-being of the household, whether it was producing food, fiber, education, healthcare, or entertainment. I happen to really like the entertainment one because in the past, entertainment was something that we created. It wasn't something we bought. You know, Mama opened the door. She kicked the kids outside. She said, go find a tree or a stick or a rock. Go play. Make up a game. Make a friend. I don't care. Get out of my hair. Also, we had people who came together to tell stories. We had people who came together to play music. But today, entertainment comes on a flat screen. We typically mount it up on the wall or we have it in a handheld device. And if we need our kids to get more exercise, we hook them up to these devices, where on a perfectly nice day, they can stand in the safety of their homes in front of their flat screens and exercise. Weird. Anyhow, in the past, we all had to produce in some way, and that was critical to our early success as a nation. If you will, think back once more to America's war for independence. Why did we win that war? We can talk about the military battles, but there's more to it than that. When the colonists first came to the shores of this country, we were completely reliant for our survival upon the British merchant ships. The deal was the colonists were supposed to harvest the natural resources that came from these lands, and they were to trade them for the goods that came over on the merchant ships for their survival. But what happened over time? We developed a local cuisine. We had craftspeople put down roots. We began to trade with each other. We were able to declare independence first and foremost because we had the ability to be independent. That's why we threw the tea into the harbor. And back in the late 1700s and early 1800s, we keenly understood this, and America entered into what historians now call the golden age of domesticity. And this is an era where the household reigned supreme. We realized that self-reliance of the American household was going to be key to our success as a nation. The home was where democratic ideals would be nurtured and instilled, and it was going to be the foundation of our economic and social welfare, and therefore the foundation of our future stability as a nation. So, what did we see? The first wave of feminism swept through the country. We had some pretty magnificent reforms, such as abolition and suffrage. By 1860, the literacy rates of men and women were equal. Girls had as much access to education as boys, and family size was growing smaller. Women were becoming more influential. As a reminder of that, remember Harriet Beecher Stowe in her 1852 novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin. She became, in the words of Abraham Lincoln, the little woman who made the big war. The golden age of domesticity was one of the last eras in our nation's history when the mind and the body were working together as one. But there was profit to be had in severing the mind from the body. And there was profit to be had in convincing people that doing the work for providing for their own needs was drudgery, and then producing that stuff in an outsourced way and marketing it back to American families for a profit, of course. And there is profit still to be had today in convincing people that they remain helpless when it comes to providing for their own needs, their education, and their entertainment, because if they will buy into this myth, they will continue to toil away in the factories and in their cubicles, and they won't want to raise questions or stir up trouble because they will believe that the only way to have a roof over their head or food in their bellies is if they're able to collect a paycheck. Most people in this country only know how to be consumers. And that, my friends, is why we have the expression, producers and consumers. It's more efficient. It's so efficient that now it's frightening. According to the Food and Ag Organization, we have lost 70% of our world's plant genetic diversity, and we stand to lose 30% of our livestock genetic diversity. 75% of the world's food supply is now coming from 12 plants and 5 animals, and 6 corporations now control 98% of the world's seed supply, leaving us highly vulnerable to disease and famine and political whim. What's equally sad is that the vast majority of 3 generations of Americans have now managed to walk this earth without knowing how to plant a garden, what foods are in season when, what cows and pigs and chickens and sheep eat. They only know how to go to work and collect a paycheck, and that they have to be able to make that paycheck go as far as possible. Incidentally, I want to be very clear here. I am not trying to suggest that all forms of paid employment are wrong. What I'm getting at, for those of you who've been following the radical homemaker stuff, is I take issue with any form of employment that robs a human being of every last shred of self-reliance he or she may have otherwise had. That's my issue here. So what am I getting at then with this expression, producers and consumers? Oh my goodness. Oh yeah, I guess I was mentioning about the people don't want to see all the travesties anymore when they collect those paychecks, do they? This is the stuff that we want to turn our backs to when we just want to collect that paycheck and try to make it go as far as possible, because we have to try to make the money work for us. But what am I getting at with this expression of producers and consumers? What I'm suggesting is there should no longer be a distinction. We should all be producers, period. Because when everyone is a producer, then our communities start to become self-sufficient. And each of us begins to hold the power to stand firm and refuse to be complicit to the ecological and social rape being committed by the interests in power. When communities are self-sufficient, it doesn't matter whether you're the Green Party or the Tea Party, or the Green Tea Party, as I think is here. There's your party, Brian. It doesn't matter, because when communities are self-sufficient, nobody goes cold and nobody goes hungry. Our agricultural genetic diversity increases and our risk of disease and famine decreases. We grow healthier because our minds and our bodies are once again working together as one, and our democratic roots start to grow stronger. And what starts to happen is that oligarchy that's in power begins to crumble away for the very simple reason why we won the war for independence. Because we no longer need it. I love speaking to groups like this. I love seeing all the nodding heads in the audience, and I know that you guys get to walk away from your lives and you come here for 2 to 4 days, depending, and we all agree, sort of. But we all face the same issue. We're going to leave here today, and this is what we're going to be confronting. These are the naysayers that populate the rest of our lives. There are going to be people who, contrary to what I learned the coaching is now that you're not supposed to talk about, they still toe that line. You can go into any conventional grocery store and hear this. They're going to suggest that America still has one of the safest food supplies in the world. And they forget things like the 2010 FDA recall of 500 million eggs from supermarket shelves. That's like enough eggs to feed breakfast to every man, woman, and child in this country. Or they want to overlook little findings, such as the fact that in 40 years, our healthcare expenditures have increased over 20 times. Or that between 1999 and 2006, the CDC estimated that 45% of American adults were suffering from chronic health conditions. And we want to call ourselves a superpower. You cannot tell me that chronic illness at these levels has nothing to do with a cheap food supply. Some folks still buy into the ideals of the Green Revolution. They believe that America needs to grow enough food to feed the world. But how much of the world's resources are being taken up feeding America's hunger for out-of-season produce, or, I'm guilty of this, the coffee and the chocolate, or new fall fashions, or electronic gewgaws that are updated and upgraded every year? If Americans began taking care of their own needs, how many resources could be freed up worldwide for other folks to take care of their own needs? There are those people out there who are fearful of the changes that I'm suggesting. They've learned that working with the body and the mind together constitutes a form of drudgery. I don't know what you learned in school, but I learned that physical work was for those who were less intelligent, and those of us with a brain were only supposed to use the brain and not the bodies. And many people are very fearful of moving away from this consumerist lifestyle. And it always surprises me why they should be afraid, because I guess they're afraid they're going to be unhappy. But I really think I have good news in this department, because I believe we've about hit rock bottom when it comes to unhappiness in this culture. Yeah. I mean, look at this. You don't want to clap for these. There's now 10 to 20 times as much depression as there was 50 years ago, and it started younger. We used to see depression set in around 29 and a half years of age. Now we're seeing it at the ages of 14 to 15. There are 750,000 suicide attempts in America every single year. That makes 2,000 per day. And the National Institute of Mental Health, this is my favorite statistic, the National Institute of Mental Health estimates that 1 out of every 4 Americans is now suffering from a diagnosable mental disorder. So, folks, look 2 people to your left and 2 people to your right, and you decide who's cuckoo. Don't worry, if they came to a PASA meeting, they'd say the ratio was way higher. But finally, there are those folks who are going to say, this is pie-in-the-sky stuff. It's not like we're all walking around with a few extra $100,000 in our back pockets that we can just go slap down on some happy farmland. Well, of course not. We have to think outside the box on this one. What we just heard about Mary's Farm is a classic example of this. According to the New York City nonprofit group Sunworks, there are 14,000 unshaded acres of rooftop in the city of New York alone, and they believe that if those rooftops could be secured and put into agricultural production, they could generate enough food to feed the city. Add to that, there are 40 million acres of lawn in this country. Folks, that makes turf grass our largest irrigated crop. Can you imagine how many chickens and turkeys and backyard pigs and zucchinis and tomatoes those lawns could grow? I know there's not a farmer in here who can look at lawns without going, such a waste, such a waste. But there's more to it than that. There are more ways than just growing food that we need. Maybe you have the ability to take some of the bones that we generate at Sapbush Hollow Farm and craft them into the useful things they used to be used for, like needles and buttons and crochet hooks. Maybe you have the ability to brew beer or wine, or you know how to take local materials and craft them into toys for small children, or you have the ability to make machinery or repair it or build tools or equipment, or you have the ability to communicate effectively, or to write, or to perform music, or theater, or literature, so that our communities are not reliant on multimedia corporations for our cultural needs. There are so many ways to produce, folks. Thank you. What matters is that we produce more than we consume. Because when that happens, the ecological footprint of each of us gets smaller, our cost of living goes down, and at the same time, our community self-sufficiency increases in these coming times of fossil fuel scarcity and climate insecurity. But the best part is that it's fun. Get to know the people in the audience. When you picked out the cuckoo, get to know that person. Because I'll bet you that person has been living in this universe for quite some time. This one that I'm talking about up here. I think you're going to find, if you get to know the people that are teaching your workshops, or the people that have been attending this membership meeting, this conference for several years, who've been living this way, you're going to find out that they're pretty happy people. They have good relationships, socially significant work, and they're having a good time. And it doesn't get better than that. So, to bring this around to where we started, and Saoirse and Ula's fascination with hearts. How many hearts could we grow if we stopped being consumers and started being producers? Hearts that would become healthy because the mind and the body are once again permitted to work together as one. And hearts that are going to be strong because of the bonds that will join human beings in neighborly interdependence and community self-sufficiency. I'm going to be straight with you here. We are facing incredible changes in our culture right now. We are confronted with dwindling dollar values, dwindling opportunities for conventional employment, dwindling fossil fuel reserves, dwindling climate security. And I want to suggest to you that in the face of all this dwindling, now is the time to be optimistic, because maybe, just maybe, we are finally having the trappings of that material culture stripped away from us, and we are being pushed to become a beneficent species on this planet, and that is an incredibly exhilarating challenge. I happen to believe that there are a few people out here in the audience, I usually meet a few every time I go out and give talks, who admit to me that they have come to an event like this because they are experiencing despair. A lot of times these are people who are trying to transition out of a more conventional life that they are finding is not making them happy. And they come to gatherings like this because they want to see other ways of living. If that describes you today, if you are here because your despair has led you here, I want to suggest to you that you attend these workshops that are left today. You take the memories you have from yesterday, and you go home and you start making that simple change. Stop being a consumer. Start being a producer. It may start with something really simple and easy that you can do. Maybe it just has to be putting your laundry on a wooden drying rack rather than putting it in the dryer. Maybe it has to be something simple. I guarantee it will move from there. The next thing you know, you're going to have a backyard garden. You're going to be having bees. Your neighbors are going to be complaining about your chickens and your guinea hens. And next thing you know, you might even have a farm. You never know. But with each move that you take, I think what you're going to discover is that the despair starts to melt away. and it's replaced by hope. And unlike fossil fuels, hope is a renewable resource. As long as we indulge it with our daily actions, hope is going to grow stronger within us, and it's going to empower us to reach out to other hearts and enable all hearts to grow. Thank you so much, folks. I had a wonderful time here this weekend.